Hello and welcome, people. It is time for our regular monthly Armchair Admirals, and this time it will be slightly different because, well, I'm here all alone. There is no Mr. Conway, but he's with us in spirit, and he sent this Uniwhale to keep watch over me. And obviously, I mean, yes, I'm here only for us, but we still have our illustrious guests. And let me introduce them. So, as in the past installment, we have with us the one, the only, the Mighty Jingles. We have with us Mr. Drachinifel, and we have Dr. Alexander Clarke. And we can now go one by one. And gentlemen, tell new players something about yourself, and don't forget the plug for your channel. So let's start with Jingles.
Hello. Oh, the camera's over here. Hello. I'm a professional. I do this for a living, as you can quite clearly tell. Yes, the Mighty Jingles, YouTube. Occasionally, I've been known to do a couple of videos about ships and tanks. Royal Navy veteran, 22 years of undetected crime in Her Majesty's Grey Funnel shipping lines. And now I do the occasional video on YouTube.
Nice. Now, Drachinifel.
Hello, Drachinifel of the YouTube channel of the same name, and apparently also the Twitter account of the same name, because, yeah, Drachinifel the everything. Drachinifel the flamethrower, coming soon when I can be able to do an episode on Greek fire.
I think...
I'm not.
I think the Boring Company was there first.
I think my one will probably do a little bit of a better job. But yes,
okay.
I do naval history, and as you can see behind me, I will also do sci-fi and dinosaurs, but not on my channel.
Okay, and Dr. Clarke.
Hello. Well, I'm Dr. Alex Clarke. I do have a naval history channel, a book coming out later in March on tribals, battles, and darings, and all sorts of things. But I also have a hammer which Drachinifel broke. This
How?
is how strong Drac is.
How did this happen?
He was helping me because I'm now in my new office outside, and we have some issues with the foundations, which he is very kindly helping between two of us. We're trying to fix. So he's a builder I can pay in iron brew and pizza, which are things I have quite a lot of. Our last builders, though, don't have much of anything else. Well, he was checking underneath the concrete slab to see what was underneath there, and this went down there, and it also was used to lever some boards off. And he is really, really strong. I think actually instead of Drachinifel, we should call him Hulk, considering he broke a hammer.
Strong like bull.
This is what happens when you have a medieval reenactment hobby that ends up with you learning to shoot 120
I'm still not
warboat for a living.
I'm still not really sure how. Really, I can't imagine how that happened. But still, there's also another historical occasion which we should document here. Now we have proof that the Mighty Jingles and Dr. Clarke are not one and the same person in disguises, because finally we have them both on the stream.
Yes, both of us were separate.
Although, no, this is the 21st century. It's amazing what they can do with deepfakes these days.
That is true. But still, in that case, at least we have a very advanced deepfake which can interact and pretend to be a human being. So, yeah.
I've been pretending to be a human being for 50 years. It's nothing new.
In any case, so the topic of today's stream is a battle that is quite often overlooked in the grand scheme of things, because, I mean, when it comes to the start of the war in the Pacific, the Pearl Harbor hawks all the infamy and all the glory, because, well, there were several movies made about it, and it was a, well, primarily American affair, so obviously the mass media are referring to Pearl Harbor more often. If someone knows something apart from Pearl Harbor, they might know something about Prince of Wales and Repulse, or the Force Z. But the Battle of the Java Sea and basically all those fights in that area, they tend to be quite, like, I would say, overlooked because, I mean, it was a very confused affair, it was a very messy affair, and it was basically light forces skirmish, so the biggest ships involved were heavy cruisers, there were no battleships, no large carrier battles, so it was kind of overlooked. And apart from that, the Allied force lost, so like nobody really wanted to dig that up too well. Oh, someone says on the YouTube that someone should give me an iron brew. Well, I'm not sure because, would you believe it, Marks and Spencer stopped selling in Prague. So
that was strangely timely for you, wasn't it?
Yeah. And yes, so to have a little bit of interaction to what was happening, how it was happening, who will volunteer to guide us quickly through the battle? Okay, so I'm putting on a map of the area.
I'm going to guide you through the battle, but I'm guiding you through the battle with the help of the 1943 copy of Brassey's Navy Annual, because they actually have an account of the battle. Despite it being not so well discussed now, in 1943 it was big news, and it's got an entire page in this book, which is quite a crammed book anyway. So it starts on page 7. On February the 20th, the Japanese landed in Bali and the Portuguese Timor. On February the 27th, they landed at 3 places on the north coast of Java, 5 divisions strong. The approach of the Japanese expedition was reported by air reconnaissance and all available Allied warships under the command of Admiral Dorman of the Royal Netherlands Navy put to sea to the attack. Admiral Dorman's flag was in the De Ruyter, a cruiser, and he had with him 4 other cruisers, the Dutch Java, the British Exeter of River Plate fame, the Australian Perth, and the American Houston, together with the Dutch destroyer Cortina and the British destroyers Jupiter, Electra, and Encounter. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a Japanese squadron was encountered consisting of at least 2 10,000-ton cruisers of the Nati class, a number of other cruisers, and some 13 destroyers. This force had obviously been interposed between the Japanese transports and the Allied squadron. The cruisers at once engaged, and at the same time the Japanese destroyers, working in 2 separate flotillas, made torpedo attacks. The first was repelled by gunfire, but the second was able to fire torpedoes, one of which hit the Cortina and sank her. About the same time, the Exeter was hit in the boiler room by an 8-inch shell, and her speed was thereby so much reduced that she was unable to keep up with the other ships and dropped out of the action. She returned independently to Surabaya to make repairs. Having fired her torpedoes to protect their withdrawal, the Japanese destroyers laid smoke, which hid the opposing squadrons from one another. The Allied destroyers, of which there were only the 3 British left, at once counterattacked through the smoke. The Electra found herself closely engaged with 3 of the largest class of Japanese destroyers, and she was sunk after a gallant fight. 54 of her company were picked up the next day by an American submarine, transferred that evening to a Dutch minesweeper, and eventually reached Australia. The Jupiter had a brief engagement with 2 Japanese destroyers, then lost sight of them in the smoke. Neither she nor the Encounter was able to fire to get torpedoes at the Japanese cruisers. As the Allied cruisers drew clear of the smoke, they again engaged the Japanese, and one of the Japanese big cruisers was seen to be on fire from the hit she had received. The Allied ships at that time suffered no further damage, but the failing light enabled the enemy to disengage. Admiral Dorman continued his efforts to gain contact with the Japanese transports. After dark, he engaged 4 enemy ships, believed to be cruisers, but was unable to work round them towards where he believed the Japanese transports to be. He therefore turned back towards the coast of Java and swept westwards along it in order to locate the landing. While so doing, he twice engaged Japanese ships, and in one of those engagements, the Jupiter was hit by a torpedo and disabled. She sank some 4 hours later, but most of her company got ashore in Java. About midnight off Rabang, the cruisers again engaged Japanese ships. While altering course during this engagement, the De Ruyter and Java were both hit at the same moment by either torpedoes or mines and sank almost at once. The other ships continued the action, and though they received some damage, it was believed that they had inflicted more on the enemy. Reports indicate that 1 Japanese 8-inch cruiser, 1 6-inch cruiser of the Magami class, and a destroyer was sunk. A second 8-inch cruiser was damaged, and 3 more destroyers were left disabled, either on fire or sinking. Nevertheless, the Japanese preponderance of forces was such that they could afford these losses and still attain their objective. HMS Perth and the USS Houston, after the action, went into Tajong Priok to refuel, leaving again after dark the next evening with the intention of passing through the Sunda Strait at night. The moon, however, was nearly full. Both ships encountered a strong Japanese force on their way to the Sunda Strait, and nothing more was heard of either. The same night, HMS Exeter, with the encounter and the American destroyer USS Pope, left Surabaya with the object of reaching Australia. One of her boiler rooms, however, was still out of action, and she could steam at no more than half power. The following day, a signal was received from her saying that 3 Japanese cruisers were approaching. Nothing more was heard from her, from either the Exeter or from the destroyers in company with her. The whole of the Allied squadron defending the Dutch East Indies was thus destroyed. It's a slightly kind account, but it's a fairly accurate account of how it happened. It's
obviously from
it's a very nice
side.
British way of putting it was an utter mess, and everything went to pot.
Yeah, I would say that we should stress that the estimate of the Japanese losses was a bit too high.
Very high, dramatically
wildly
high.
exaggerated, I think is the phrase you're looking for.
But it was, this account was published in 1943. So I still think it's quite, despite it having the wildly inaccurate Japanese in it, it's actually quite accurate about what the Allies were getting up to and what was going wrong with them. Yeah. So I consider it quite good reporting for the time.
It's also interesting in all these contemporary accounts to see what names actually Allies used for different Japanese ship classes, because there was often a lot of like wrong transcriptions, wrong names, sometimes inventing names and stuff like that. What was that? Natty class cruisers, right?
Yes.
Somebody just pointed out in chat, I've got the headphones on back to front.
Oh. So
yeah, I knew that.
Thanks
it was
for
a
the
new way to wear them, wasn't it?
Thanks for the introduction. I mean, as you can see from the description, even the battle was a very confused matter, and it was in large part, thanks to what you see actually on the map that is now on the screen. You can see that on the Japanese side there is only one flag. It was all Japanese force, but on the Allied side there are actually 4 flags. Because that's what was the name of the task force. The ABDA command or ABDA fleet was Australian, British, Dutch, American force. So basically 4 navies, 2 of them fully compatible. One of them compatible thanks to the shared language, at least, partially shared, and one of them with a completely different even language. So,
and of course, that was the one that was in charge, which made things even more difficult.
Yes,
and all 4 at different places in the development cycle. So you have the fact that the Dutch have a lot of great technology coming through, but hasn't yet been implemented. So their navy is actually, despite having really great technology like the Hayesmere and other things coming up, their ships actually deployed are not really that great. Whereas the British and Americans actually, you can almost say, are almost on a parity in some ways at this point.
Yeah.
They are, in terms of their technological cycle position, they've got fairly good used to use it equipment up there, but they haven't got their latest stuff, but they've got actually slightly newer stuff than the Dutch. But it's not as good as the Dutch have got in development, but the Dutch stuff isn't actually available.
Yes.
It's a mess.
It's a mess. The signals were obviously also messy. And the entire situation as well, because as you can see, the Japanese forces were actually getting into the area from several directions, even though the main push was coming from the east, and basically both sides were very confused in this situation. There were several earlier skirmishes where, for example, a group of the old American force-taker destroyers managed to get in, to ambush a small Japanese transport convoy, and caused quite a lot of havoc given the quality of the ships and but that was basically one off. There were other confused episodes, like Japanese cruisers actually managing to hit Japanese transport with torpedoes because they were launching them while the Allied ships were between the cruisers and the transports.
Well, that was a bit later than Java C.
Yeah, but it was as part of this whole confused campaign. And I think part of the confusion was also that basically for both sides this was kind of a shoestring operation, which is kind of surprising for the Japanese because this was actually their main war objective, right? Like they had to succeed here to get all the resources they needed.
All
but
of the rubber and
still,
the oil from the Dutch East Indies.
Yeah, but still from the Japanese side, this campaign was basically heavy cruisers, later supported by carriers and by land-based aviation.
But you have to remember the Japanese are throwing a lot of, how do I put this, Hail Marys at the same time. If you consider the march on Singapore, the British end up surrendering because the British Army commander forgot to put a garrison on the reservoir, so the Japanese managed to capture the water supply, and the British surrendered about a day or before the Japanese ran out of food. So, if the British had decided to, well, we've got quite a lot of water stored, we'll keep going for a bit longer and see if we can hold out, they might have actually ended with the Japanese having to surrender or at least withdraw from them because they wouldn't have had any food. You have to remember the sheer amount of logistics that had to go into the Pearl Harbor operation and to getting that done really did drain a lot of the ability of Japan to push its forces out, because they have to devote so many resources to getting that Hail Mary done. Everything else is sort of on a shoestring, and you're sort of going, how are you doing this? They're having immense luck, but also they kind of read their enemies correctly in that they realized we're going to be a load of confused headless chickens.
Yeah, but the other thing you've got to remember is that it's not, when you're looking at the force breakdown, it's easy to just look at skimming it and go, oh, okay, both sides have a couple of heavy cruisers, the Allies have an additional light cruiser, the Japanese have a few more destroyers, it must be something of an even fight. But it's actually nowhere near that, even putting aside the communications problems that you have in ABDA command, and because 4 different navies, 3 different languages, basically. And when you actually look at the ships themselves, the heavy cruisers the Japanese have, they're 2 Miyoko class, so they're both moving around with 10 8-inch guns, and let's just say the Miyoko class, like many Japanese heavy cruisers, took the treaty limit displacements as more of a suggestion than actually.
And they were specifically designed to counter light cruisers.
Yes, and then you've got on the Allied side their 2 counterparts, Exeter and Houston. Exeter is a diminutive of the County class, so it's only got 6 guns in the first place, and it's not a full 10,000-ton ship. It's explicitly designed to be a smaller, lighter version. Houston, on the other hand, is roughly contemporary. It's a couple of years older than the Miyokos, but theoretically should be on a par with them. But unfortunately, due to previous action, it's only got 2 of its 3 turrets working, so it's also down to 6 guns. So just on the heavy lineup, the Allies are actually down to almost half as many heavy guns. And Exeter's crew, whilst they had demonstrated superb gunnery at River Plate, and it subsequently had Type 274 radar fitted, which in theory should have made it even more accurate, had also had most of the crew that had been at River Plate replaced. So the crew that was now on Exeter was basically fresh and green. So its gunnery performance was not brilliant. And then when you look at the light cruisers, see, there is, at least in gun power, something more of a balance, because the 2 Japanese light cruisers are pretty old and fairly lightweight. But on the other hand, we're not talking about Brooklyn class or Town class cruisers here. We're talking about that the Dutch cruisers are pretty much about the same weight. They're fairly small and of a similar kind of armament. Perth is probably the best light cruiser present, but she's still a Leander, so she's still also a relatively small light cruiser. So there's no massive advantage for the Allies in that respect. And then you have the destroyers. You've got destroyers from 3 different navies, some of them getting on a bit. The Japanese have a superiority in numbers of destroyers, and of course those destroyers are in part rocking around with the long lance torpedoes. Some of them have slightly older Type 90s, but even then the Japanese are quite superior in torpedoes, and this will tell during the battle.
We can actually say, I think safely, that this was one of the very few engagements where the extreme range requirement for the Type 93 torpedoes did pay off, because it's basically that's another thing. Basically, the ABDA fleet was performing evasive maneuvers, but they in the end ended up getting them in the path of the torpedo salvo. So it's another thing was that ABDA command suffered some bad luck already earlier, some attrition, because they lost 2 light cruisers earlier during the Battle of Makassar Strait and the Battle of Bandung Strait. At Makassar Strait, the USS Marblehead was hit by bomb and heavily damaged, so it had to retreat. And in the same engagement, the Houston's number 3 turret was damaged and disabled, so that also quite influenced the performance of Houston, because with the number 3 turret gone, it had issues engaging enemy while retreating. It was limited to the front turret, and
And every time an Allied ship an Allied ship was damaged and not sunk, one of the destroyers had to be detached to escort it back to safety. So it was almost as if, if you can disable a ship but not sink it, we're actually getting 2 for the price of 1.
Yeah.
And in the Bandung Strait, just a week before, Dutch light cruiser, the Trump, was again damaged and again had to retreat. So basically, the Allies started with a fairly strong, if inconsistent fleet, but basically they were weaned little by little by various engagements, various air raids, and
This was one of the biggest problems with ABDA command. In theory, if on paper, if you lined up all the ships and aircraft and troops they theoretically had under their command, it was actually an incredibly powerful force. The only problem was it was scattered across pretty much the entirety of the Western Pacific and parts of India. And because it was made up of these 4 different navies, it was based in 4 completely different locations. Whereas the Japanese were acting as a single unified unit. Obviously, the British mostly at this point based out of Singapore and their holdings more to the west of the operational theatre. The Australians are down in the south, although apart from Perth, Perth is their sole representative here. The Dutch are based in the Dutch East Indies, which is where this battle takes place, which is under attack at that point. And obviously the Americans are in the process of trying to reconsolidate after the Japanese have launched their assaults into the Philippines, which is where most of the forward-based American units were based at the time. So it means that a lot of the ABDA command forces are being picked off either through damage or destruction before they get a chance to properly consolidate themselves.
And the elephant in the room, the elephant in the room is that Force C has been lost. And let's be honest, if Force Z dead, then HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse had still been around, they would have been centerpieces that you could have built this force around and would have made it far more capable. Leaving aside the concept of, Courageous or Glorious or Ark Royal hadn't been damaged during the war, so the British had actually managed to send an aircraft carrier out there. Leaving that all to one side, if Force C hadn't been lost doing a similar action, defending Singapore, like this ABDA force is trying to defend Java, they could well have been a very critical asset to these operations.
It'd be difficult to imagine the Japanese heavy cruisers wanting to go toe-to-toe with a pair of ships like the Repulse or the Prince of Wales.
Yes, especially considering that they combined, certainly on Prince of Wales, they combined the latest and greatest for what constituted that in 1942 radar with a fairly experienced gunnery crew, which is what Exeter lacked. I mean, the long lance, the use of the long lance, it's kind of a swings and roundabout situation because yes, it does have some fairly critical effect because of its extreme long range and the fact that the Japanese ships are designed to carry reload, so they're able to launch this extremely long range volley at a point where the Allies just flat out don't believe that torpedoes can even reach, and then later on during the engagement they can reload and come back in for a second volley, and that being at closer range actually does considerably more damage. That's how most of the torpedo kills are scored, but they're able to do both. And that first salvo, although it only hits a single ship, it does disrupt the Allied fleet's efforts, which makes things more difficult for them as time goes on. And I mean, yeah, it takes a lot of long lances for them to achieve it, but ultimately, if you've got a long lance is an expendable weapon, you can make more. It's much more difficult. It's much easier to resupply a set of long lances than it is to build a new destroyer or a set of cruisers.
There was a question in the chat whether the Allied forces had any air support. They had, but it suffered the same problems as the others. There were Buffaloes flying from one place. There were, I believe, American, U.S. Army Air Force fighters based by that time somewhere in the area as well. There were the Dutch Fokkers, but like all these available air forces, all these fighters were, for one, stationed far off, for two, didn't have any proper communication with the Navy, so couldn't really find the ships they would be tasked to protect, even if they were tasked to protect them. They, again, didn't speak the same language, didn't have the same frequencies on the radio, and it was just a terrible mess.
Yeah, and there were attempts by Allied air forces to strike at various Japanese forces during this time, but a combination, as you say, of poor communications and the fact that, to be perfectly honest, they weren't that good at anti-shipping strikes at this point. Meant that they didn't really achieve all that much. And yeah, in the battle itself, there isn't air support available, for one, because of these communications issues and exactly where everybody's based, and for two, also, one of the things about Java Sea, it lasts a long time. It starts off in pretty much the middle of daylight hours in the afternoon, but it continues well into the evening and well into the night. So any air support they might have had at the beginning would have long been gone.
It's the sort of scenario where if you were doing a plain paper reading and just putting the forces next to each other, you'd go, wow, ABDA's going to win this non-stop. And then you look at the actual, it's often matters. It's how much of that force can be brought to bear and can work together. And again, it's World War II is one of those wars which really likes to rip up all the theories which have been going around in the decades or so previously about how future wars are going to be fought. You know, you've had the bomber will always get through. You've had the torpedo bombers and will wipe out enemy forces. Land-based bombers will wipe out enemy forces. You only need 34 light bombers to defend Singapore, was what one paper wrote at one point, and that will stop any enemy ships or any attacks on Singapore. All these things are getting destroyed, and one of the biggest things to get destroyed is the idea that navies can easily work together if they haven't practiced. Because you think, how much effort did the Royal Navy and the various Commonwealth navies had they spent time working together regularly? It was a major thing. It was part of the whole Royal Navy, Commonwealth Navy ethos. But you had politicians in America, in Britain, in France, in the Netherlands, who all believed in their various war plans they were going out fighting alongside allies, and it would be a seamless integration with just a few minutes and some diplomacy. And it really wasn't. It really is complicated. And you can actually say that in many ways, the Battle of Java has this huge impact on modern day forces, in that the entire idea of the NATO exercise regime, which for us will all seem quite common that's done today, comes from not the lessons of later in the war or the big successes, but the big failure of ABDA, because from that point onwards, you start realizing we need to practice together. Before D-Day, you've got Americans and British practicing alongside each other before they get to France. So when they're fighting in France, the troops understand each other. The ships understand each other. When they're fighting in Mediterranean, when they're on taking part in Torch, and you've got the huge Allied fleets coming together for that, they spend weeks or the whole journey exercising non-stop with their own aircraft, doing attacks, everything, to try and build up this combination. And yet you have poor Admiral Dorman is literally given this force, told to defend Java, and told, oh, by the way, you don't have any time to get it ready. They're going to attack in about 2 days' time. Go, have fun. I'm surprised the guy didn't. I don't know. If I'd have been him, I'd have been asking for a pay rise. You know, at least a rank bump, because frankly, he deserved it for trying to even take on that challenge.
That actually touches a question. Well, there were several questions in the Twitch chat about this. Basically, what did each of the sides know about the other? What was the intelligence? Was there, for example, on the Allied side, was there any warning from the Ultra or Magic? On the Japanese side, how was their information about basically the dispositions of the ABDACOM and about the strength of the Allied forces in the area?
Sorry, go ahead, Jingles.
I was going to say, they knew an invasion was about to take place. They had a fairly good idea of where, but they didn't know how or exactly when. So they were kind of left fishing, which is why when ABDA sailed, they didn't actually know the locations of the convoys they were supposed to be intercepting when they sailed, and they didn't even get a reasonably good idea until long after they'd sailed. So they were kind of on a bit of a fishing expedition. I don't think, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, Ultra by 1942 was there, but you weren't getting the same kind of successes as you would later in the war. They certainly weren't relying on Ultra intercepts. But there's still a lot that you can gain from signals intelligence, even if you don't understand, even if you can't break the codes, just the amount of signals intelligence, and if you can figure out who's sending what, even if you can't figure out what they're saying, just by the amount of radio traffic that's being generated, that will often tell you a lot. And this was basically what they were working with.
Yeah, and the other thing is you've got to think about is what I tend to call long-term intelligence. So not just the immediate tactical situation of whose ships are where in this particular theater. It's also how much do you appreciate about the enemy's general defenses, about their general tactical considerations, and about how they're going to fight. Because thanks to one of the German merchant raiders, the Japanese had about a year and a half previously got their hands on the full breakdown of all the British defences, plans, etc. for the area. So they knew that. They'd been using the pre-war period quite happily to investigate what the Dutch had and what they might do in the Dutch East Indies. They were obviously got the Americans on the back foot thanks to Pearl Harbor. And on the flip side, on the Allied side, something that you see to varying degrees depending on the nation, but runs as a common theme through it all, the Allies massively underestimate the capabilities of the Japanese, both as a people and in their ships as well. As we saw from that the summary in Brassi's that Dr. Clarke read at the beginning, they're still suffering under the illusion that the Japanese actually built treaty-compliant cruisers, for one thing. And on another note, you have people writing wonderful articles like, we don't think the Japanese will be very good at night fighting because they have slitted eyes and therefore they can't see very well. Yeah. When in actual fact, the Japanese are one of the two navies that are actually really good at night fighting, which comes as a rude surprise to almost everybody. So And I mean, even with the long lance, as I've mentioned in the video I did on that torpedo, the Americans had the full technical specs of the long lance. They technically knew that it could do this kind of long range salvo impact, but they concluded that because they hadn't built a torpedo that could do that, then surely the Japanese couldn't have built a torpedo that did that. So therefore, this report must be entirely wrong. So everyone sailed off into battle, the Americans obviously not sharing intelligence they considered to be faulty, and sailed into a bunch of long lances they weren't expecting.
And you even had this fight going on inside navies. One of the good examples, Admiral Noble, is the pre-war commander of British forces in the China station. He's a very, very senior, experienced admiral. He comes back, he's put in charge of Western Approaches Command. And there are two problems with him as far as people are concerned. One, he keeps telling them how capable the Japanese Navy are and how they shouldn't be being discounted. And two, he's not a submariner, so therefore he can't understand how to deal with submarines. He actually sets in place everything, which then Sir Max Hawson comes in afterwards and basically takes credit for and goes, "Look how brilliant I am! Everything I'm doing is winning the convoy war." And you go, "When did it all start? 6 months, 12 months, 18 months before you were put in post?" Okay, yeah, Max, you did well there. You basically just kept what your predecessors done in. And he's sent, Admiral Noble is then sent across to America, where he gets into even more fights with various Americans, especially King, because he keeps going, the Japanese are really quite technically good here. The Japanese are really quite good. I've spent about 3 years keeping track on them and floating around in the China station and going and visiting the Japanese on a regular basis and looking at their ships on a regular basis. They're really quite capable.
Ernest King might have believed that if it hadn't been an Englishman telling him it.
Yeah.
To be fair, if it hadn't been an Englishman called Noble, I think that was just added. That just made it worse.
That was adding insult to the injury. Yes, that's. Yeah. I think actually, we've covered the basics quite well, so we can switch to the pre-registered questions, and obviously we will be taking questions from the chat as well. So let's start with just a basic, simple question from Willow Friend. What was the strategic goal of the entire Dutch East India campaign? And well, the strategic goal was resources. There was oil on Borneo, there was food on Java, there were various rare minerals, and all sorts of resources that Japan quite desperately needed. And basically the Dutch East Indies was the war aim of the Japan, because like, the idea was capture them before the Allies can react, hold them, force the Allies to like sign off the fait accompli and profit. So yeah, that was the strategic goal. The operational goal obviously was taking all major Allied bases, taking all islands, so that basically you can secure the Borneo, because it gets annoying if your tankers carrying your precious oil are being sunk by various things. So that's why the Dutch East Indies campaign, that's also why the Philippines campaign, and why like the war with the US started in the end, because basically Japanese knew that it is inevitable sooner or later, and if they didn't start war with the US and tried to get the Dutch East Indies, then there will still be Philippines sitting right on that sea lanes and ready to cut them off at any time.
And to
I
be
swear
fair,
this cat has the worst possible timing.
Hey, look, even my fluffy research hasn't turned up yet. The Dutch East Indies is supposed to be the perfect target because, of course, the Netherlands is occupied by Germany, and they might well have been under the government of the Free Dutch, and sort of basically not sort of Japanese aren't able to do what they are able to do with Vietnam and French Indochina, which is basically just claimed them, and France can't do anything about it. But what they are is they're resource rich, and they are supposed to be not reinforced. And there is part of the Japanese which honestly expects the British on the Americans not to bother much. But there again, they can't count the Dutch, the Americans out, and the Germans are their allies, so they start factoring in this whole war scenario, which actually ends up, and we have to think about this, the Japanese give, of course, Roosevelt a very nice reason to enter the war, because Hitler decides to declare war on him, so that means Roosevelt's job of trying to work out how he's going to interfere in the European war is made immensely easier, all thanks to the Japanese. Basically, they made Churchill a very happy man. Very sad man, because he lost Repulse and HMS Prince of Wales out of it, but there again, he did go against the entire Navy's advice of don't deploy battleships out there without carriers, send them to the Indian Ocean and have them wait there.
Well, there is actually a question that nobody picked, but I think since we mentioned the friendly fire incident, we can jump to it quickly from the really good man. If the Japanese army found out it was the Miyoko and therefore the Japanese Navy who sank the transport in an epic torpedo salvo fail instead of the USS Houston, could the push into Southeast Asia have ended there and then, as what little cooperation between the army and navy would dissolve? Well, I don't think it would dissolve, but it might make the army more careful when the navy came assuring them that they will supply them on Guadalcanal. So,
what is this cooperation between the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army of which you speak?
Yeah, this is the Battle of Sunda Strait, which is the next engagement after the Battle of Java Sea. But yeah, to be perfectly honest, given that there were legitimately assassinations going on at points between the Japanese army and navy, short of the navy flat out refusing to transport the army, which the emperor wouldn't allow, or the army shelling the navy, it's difficult to imagine how relationships between the two could have gotten much worse, considering that in later campaigns such as on Guadalcanal, you'd have the army straight up lying to the navy about what they'd managed to accomplish, and then the navy getting very surprised when they, for some bizarre reason, actually believed the army and ended up getting blasted by Allied air power as a result.
I mean, it was a fair turnaround because the navy promised to keep them fed, right?
Yeah, this is true. But yeah,
to your earlier point, even with the refusal to carry troops on naval transports, I mean, there was a reason why the Japanese army had a quite considerable fleet of transports of their own, including the amphibious transports and including light aircraft carriers. That's like
yes.
I can't remember the name of the Japanese infantry division commander at the Battle of the Sunda Strait, but he managed to get torpedoed. He was one of the ones who actually got his ship torpedoed out from underneath them and had to swim ashore. He was one of their better infantry commanders.
Yes.
Can't remember his name.
And wasn't a very happy man afterwards.
No, not at all.
Well, are we talking about 2nd or 48th Division? Because I've got up their list names because I was worried I'd start mispronouncing them. So you've got Maruyama Maso or Yuetsu Tushashi.
I think it was Maruyama, no?
Okay, the first one. I can't remember.
I'm not sure.
2nd Division.
Yeah.
I think it was him, actually, yeah.
Another question from Yamato 8125. Does the ABDA lack of coordination and the Japanese jamming the Allied fleet radio frequencies are they the main factor for this defeat?
Certainly didn't help.
Didn't help, yeah.
No.
Yeah.
But there were other factors which we kind of have already discussed. The lack of cooperation, the lack of opportunity to train. This cat is really... but, I mean, if you look at even something as simple as their radio codes, the Americans, the British and the Australians were operating from the same signals code book. They had this thing called ACP 131, Allied Communications Publication 131, which is not a classified document. You can actually buy it. And the codes, they're basically 3-letter codes. Because when you transmit via Morse code, it takes you about 12 times as long to transmit radio check, how do you hear me over? Or you can just send 2 3-figure groups. INT, which is interrogative, which lets them know that you're asking a question, Zulu, Bravo, Zulu. And that basically means radio check, how do you hear me over? Sending that is a lot more efficient by saying int ZBZ than it is to transmit that whole thing. We had it, the Australians had it, the Americans had it, the Dutch didn't have it. and the Dutch were in charge. So,
You
it didn't help.
Yeah.
you actually start to wonder if actually the biggest loss was Repulse and Prince of Wales, and yes, they were a big loss. But Admiral Tom Phillips, if he'd survived, would have probably been made the force commander because he'd have been a senior officer out there, and that's one of the reasons why
Yes.
Dawn was. And then it would have been, in the nicest way, a British officer who's used to that code system and that communications, trying to coordinate things. So yes, the Japanese jamming has an impact. But if the forces were all taught, if the senior officer was actually talking from the same code book as the rest of his forces were, that would have also had quite a useful impact.
Yeah, the degree of disunity and the fact it was such a new command really didn't help as well, because, I mean, as anyone who's studied naval history to any degree will appreciate, whilst a good officer is free thinking, as a good subordinate officer, a good subordinate officer doesn't just randomly abandon the main fleet on their own initiative. I'm sure Jingles can back that up. So you want to have captains who think for themselves, but you're not going to you don't want captains who are just going to go, yep, no, I think I'm done. I'm just going to leave now.
Unless they are called Nelson.
But this was the problem, in that ABDA command was a theoretical command, and yes, Dorman was notionally in charge, but the various captains or squadron commanders, as applicable within his fleet, had their own ideas about how things should be done, and didn't view themselves fully as answering to him. So later during the engagement, you have the 4 US destroyers. They initially try to get close enough to the Japanese ships to launch a torpedo attack. They can't because of the Japanese gunnery, so they launch their torpedoes anyway, even though they're hopelessly outside of range. But then later on, in sort of the interim between the two big engagements, the American destroyer commander basically decides, actually, I think I'm going to take my ships and leave. Now, the Japanese jamming obviously means he can't actually tell Dorman, I'm leaving. I'm off to go off and try and resupply. But I have a distinct feeling if that had been a purely American command, there is no way that guy would have thought, I'm just going to wander off and do my own thing.
Would never have happened.
Yeah.
No.
I mean, it
even
could
if
happen
had been
accidentally,
a British
but
admiral, he would probably have
yeah.
not done it as well.
Yeah.
It's the case of there is a perception from the Americans and the British that the Dutch, the only reason Dorman's in charge is because he's senior, not because he's considered really any good.
Yeah.
And he then combines it by, and this is a terrible failing in a senior officer, he's a nice guy. And he tries to be friendly with everyone. Whereas if he had been a rude ARSEHOLE, just in case my little cousins are watching, he'd have probably actually got them under control. That's the sad thing. Because they'd have all hated him, but they wouldn't have dared annoy him.
Yeah, there's another question that actually ties in also into the entire command. I mean, there was one question in Twitch, and one question submitted before from Balin Greyjoy.
Oh dear.
Is it true that Admiral Hart and Admiral Glassford both wanted to pull the US Asiatic fleet back to Australia immediately after the Philippines fell, but Admiral King and FDR overruled them for political reasons and sacrificed them just to keep Churchill and the Dutch happy? And the related question to that, which was that, or it was rather common that each of these three forces had also like basically different main objective and main goal, what they kind of wanted to achieve in the area. So basically, what were the goals for the Dutch? What were the goals for the British? What were the goals for the Americans?
Yeah, this is where there is a bit of a conflict, because obviously the Dutch East Indies are under attack. Rather, obviously, the Dutch objective is to defend the Dutch East Indies. The British, they recognise the importance of the Dutch East Indies, but even though they want to defend it, they're viewing it as a stage in their defense.
Yes,
Like,
they want
okay,
to defend Australia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we defend here, if that falls, we fall back. We'll do our best job, but it's not kind of back against the wall, do or die. Whereas for the Dutch, it basically is. And as far as the Americans go, it's not just politics for why Admiral King wants to keep the US, tells the US forces they have to stay in the area. It's also the fact that, bear in mind, this whole thing really has kicked off because the Americans have embargoed the Japanese oil imports. So the Japanese are running out of oil. They've launched this war and this campaign at the time they have because they, as we said before, they want the Dutch East Indies for the oil. Admiral King, whilst he may have been absolutely furious with absolutely everyone at all times, also had a fairly good strategic head on his shoulders, and he knew that if you let the Dutch East Indies fall quickly and easily, you're basically letting the Japanese have the resources that the Americans were trying to starve them of. So whilst for some people, yes, it might have looked like a better idea to just let the Japanese have the Dutch East Indies and fall back to a more defensible position in Australia, every day that they could buy to stop the Japanese getting to the Dutch East Indies was a day less that the Japanese had of pumping Dutch oil, and a day more of oil that they were expending. And warships go through an awful lot of oil very quickly. But also, it could possibly give the Dutch time to sabotage some of the oil production. Now, obviously, the Americans can't order the Dutch to do that, but the longer the fight goes on, the more time they have to exercise that option if they want, which again serves to hopefully either deny or delay Japanese access to the oil.
Which
And
obviously,
again, I
on
would
the other
point out,
hand,
Admiral King, would anyone have deserted him? No, because thoroughly furious the whole time. So again, this is my point. Dorman is a lovely and a good admiral, but he's too nice for the job.
Yeah, just to the point of the Dutch destroying the infrastructure. Obviously, on the other hand, the Dutch were not really too eager to do it too early because, well, I mean, what if you manage to stop the Japanese, right? Then you have destroyed everything for nothing. But in the end, there was quite a lot of infrastructure damage that, again, the Japanese had to start fixing.
Yeah.
And there was even there's another comment from DKY Sven. In his memories, Admiral Helfrich complained that the strike force should have been assembled earlier and attacked more northerly, and particularly blames the Asiatic fleet for wasting the first months of the war cruising around too far south next to Australia. Do you think an earlier concentration was possible and would have achieved more?
Certainly possible. But was there a need for? I mean, it's all well. I mean, it's very easy after the fact to say, well, you should have done this, you should have done that, you should have done this. And yes, you're absolutely right. They should have. But nobody at the time. I mean, they could probably have been able to predict that the Japanese were going to be going for the Dutch East Indies because that's where all the resources were. The reason why they attacked Pearl Harbor in the first place, to clear the way so that they could seize those resources. And yeah, absolutely. If they'd started exercising together earlier, if they'd shared codes, if they had worked out communication plan and clear chains of command, absolutely. But they didn't. And they didn't for very good reasons, because they were taken completely by surprise. Now, the fact that they were taken completely by surprise points to a staggering failure in intelligence, but that's not the fault of the naval commanders. So, you can point the finger, and you're absolutely right. It shouldn't have gone as badly as it did, as quickly as it did. But unfortunately, it kind of did. And this is what led to the complete destruction of the ABDA force.
Yeah, if I would add my comment here, basically given what we discussed earlier, like if the striking force was assembled earlier, I think the biggest benefit would have been that they would actually spend some time together to iron out the communications, because pushing them into a premature action more northerly would get them closer to the land-based Japanese air, which would not be good. And they would still have the same crucial problem of not being able to talk to each other, which even closer to the enemy bases would be probably even more disastrous. So Yeah,
The other thing
it's
you've
like
got to think
hindsight
about
is
is
2020, but
the other thing you've got to consider is long-term basing, because if you think about the four forces that are making up ABDA command, the Americans did have fairly extensive basing in the Philippines, but now they don't because invasion and all that. The British have fairly extensive basing in Singapore because they've been trying to build that up as part to base the fleet out of. The Australians have a reasonable amount of basing, partly a holdover from World War One when they had a battle cruiser, partly because they actually have a reasonable sized force for a smaller navy at the start of the war. The Dutch have basing in the Dutch East Indies for their fleet and a few guests, but most of the Dutch fleet is actually already there. If you look at the number of Dutch ships that escaped or were either escaped the Netherlands or were captured in the Netherlands by the German advance, there's not a particularly large amount of them. Most of the Dutch cruisers, a good chunk of their destroyers, are all over in the Dutch East Indies. And if you theoretically pile the American ships and the Australian ships and the British ships, plus most of the Dutch Navy, into the Dutch East Indies, the Dutch naval infrastructure there isn't designed to support a fleet of that size for any considerable time.
And
sure, they can keep them supplied in fuel.
Yeah.
That much is easy, but the rest of it, not so much.
And the logistics facilities, this was another thing that I was going to mention earlier, but completely forgot. The logistics facilities that they had were designed to support the Dutch Navy, who weren't firing the same ammunition as the British, Australian, and Americans.
Yes.
Fuel, yeah, sure. Food, yeah, sure. At a stretch, they could maybe round up enough to keep all of the nations supplied, operating out of their facilities. But as far as the rest of the logistical infrastructure was concerned, no way. They just didn't have the facilities. Australia would have a similar problem later after the fall of the Dutch East Indies with places like Darwin being able to accommodate the small Australian Navy, but being woefully unprepared to handle all of the British and American ships that were now trying to operate from the northern coast of Australia. They actually had the submarines in particular. I can't remember whose book I was reading, but it was the commander of the American submarine fleet in the southern Pacific. Basically got into a jeep and drove up the northern Australian coast, just looking for places where he could build a fresh submarine base. So the facilities were not up to the task required of them.
Yeah, and it comes down to simple things like measurements, because the Americans, Australians, and British are all using feet and inches. The Dutch are using metrics. So yes. It's even when you look at the light cruisers, if you get a British ship show up, or the Perth, or if an American cruiser shows up, they have 6-inch guns and 8-inch guns. The Dutch have 150mm, which is 2mm smaller than 6-inch.
I believe the only possible commonality there was the Dutch and British destroyers with the 4.7-inch guns, but that was about it. Another thing is that quite often overlooked is that both the British and the American fleets in the area basically lost their major bases, or were in the process of losing them, because the Cavite in the Manila Bay was unavailable anymore after the Japanese attack on Philippines. The Singapore was in quite a big spot of inconvenience as well. So basically, there were the small Dutch facilities and there were the facilities on the Australian coast, but that was not enough, and that was again a problem in keeping
and what you
these
have
forces.
To remember is if they had
sea.
the intelligence to start organising everything earlier, they'd have probably had the intelligence that the British would have sent out an aircraft carrier, because if the British had realised that an attack was this likely, that nothing they were going to do, they would have probably found an aircraft carrier from one of the ones they had operating, because they do find them quite quickly when they realise they do need them. So, because the British do have aircraft carriers around doing things, they're doing things in the North Atlantic, they're doing things in the South Atlantic, they're doing things in the Mediterranean with aircraft carriers. The reason they don't send one out with Force Z is because literally They're going, it's just a deterrence force. It's not going to happen immediately. And we've got higher priorities, and we've lost Ark Royal, Courageous, and Glorious because of stupidity. All three.
Oh, but
Various
was
levels and different ways, but we've lost them. And so if you'd had that intelligence, you'd have A, had the British aircraft carrier, you'd have B, had the forces probably coordinating and moving up and operating out of Singapore together, which would have actually had the facilities to support quite a lot of those ships operating together. And it would have been a combined fleet, and it would have been a very different battle with the Japanese. And you might not even be talking about a battle of Java, but you don't have that intelligence. So they are reacting to events as best they can with what they have available. And you always fight a war and fight a battle with what you have, not what you would like to have or what you could have had in hindsight if you'd just known a few weeks, a few months earlier.
But wasn't there actually supposed to be a carrier accompanying the force that ran into a sandbar or something?
There had been plans for a carrier. It didn't so much ran into a sandbar as the one which they was theoretically going to be doing had a bit of a snafu. But again, if it had been, that's the thing. If it had been a high priority, then one of the others would have been re-rolled and sent out there. That's what would have been done. But you've got, I think it's both the Illustrious and Formidable are in repair at this point. Ark Royal was lost because of someone making error with the counter-flooding. Glorious and Courageous were lost, one because she didn't have any air cover flying and she got caught by the Scharnhorst and Eisenhower, and the other one because they were using a full fleet carrier to play anti-submarine warfare hunting.
Yeah.
Which is a good idea to have an aircraft carrier for, but it's what you use an escort carrier for, not a full fleet carrier.
Yeah,
So,
which
as I
again,
said, stupidity.
yeah, again at that time the escort carrier production was basically just beginning. So yeah, it was like come as you are, not come as you want to be. I will just quickly interrupt because we have something. I've seen some questions in the chat, and we actually have something for you guys out there. Also for the guys on the YouTube, and we have a bonus code, which is Serobaya Okikaizen, which I think is no big surprise, is a Japanese name for the Battle of the Java Sea, or Battle of Surabaya, because, well, that's also quite frustrating sometimes when you are trying to go through Japanese site descriptions of the battles around Guadalcanal, and basically while in the Western terminology you have the Battle of the Savo Island, the Battle of Tasafaronga, Night Battle of Guadalcanal, Battle of Cape Esperance. For the Japanese, it's just first Battle of Savo Island, second Battle of Savo Island, and so on. So that can be sometimes a bit confusing. Oh, spelling sometimes rushed. Okay, here's the code again. Surabaya Okikaizen.
That's just cruel.
Yeah. I know. I actually cannot really make it stay longer, but I can make it appear repeatedly. So yeah.
It's the joys of technology.
Yes. Yeah, there were a lot of questions in the pre-filled questions, and I think we touched it already, how it would have looked if Force Z had not been lost. But, well, in that case, the Japanese heavy cruisers are in big trouble.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it might urge the Japanese Navy to deploy the Congos a bit more forward, even though I'm not sure what they were actually doing at that time. I mean,
If they did that, it would cost a lot more in fuel to get down there. And remember, this is the thing, the Japanese...
Yes.
So if you have them there, Congos come, a lot more fuel gets used.
Yes.
But I think if the repulse of the Prince of Wales had been involved, then we would have seen a lot more hostile aircraft than we had.
Yeah.
Probably, yes.
I mean, this is the thing is with I think with any naval counterfactual or alternate history that extends much beyond a day, you have to start accounting for what the enemy's going to do.
Yeah.
And so it's like, yeah, if Prince of Wales and Repulse had survived, that gives ABDA Command a huge shot in the arm in terms of combat strength. But the Japanese aren't going to sit there for the next several weeks and go, yeah, you know what, let's send a couple of heavy cruisers out to fight them. They'll send something heavier. You never know. It might actually persuade them to shake loose Nagato and Mutsu, which would be an interesting thing.
I think I might have delayed the invasion until it could have neutralized ABDA, because ABDA would have posed a much more significant threat with those two capital ships. But they would have neutralized ABDA. They had the forces available.
And by the time of the Java Sea, the Japanese airplanes had already coverage of the area, which I mean, it's as shown by earlier losses to the Allied cruisers. Basically, out of ABDACOM lost 3 cruisers before the battle, just going for repairs, because I think I forgot about Boise, even though I'm not sure that was a submarine.
Boise was a Brooklyn class.
Yeah. No, but I mean, why did she get out? The real ABDACOM
ran aground on a sandbar? Or something like that.
That was a lot of that going around.
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
they move. They're just not annoying.
This all comes into the whole disorganized nature of ABDA Command. You've got ships all over the place with different roles, having been tasked to different roles and to different locations by their respective admiralties. And when you want to get them all assembled for something like this, you've got to effectively negotiate with those different admiralties and go, okay, have you stopped using it for this role? Can we have it now? Okay, now we've got it now, but now it's over there. We've got to get it over here. But between there and here might be more Japanese, so that could be a problem.
For example, theoretically, the Asiatic fleet had another heavy cruiser in the area, the Pensacola, I believe, but she was on a convoy duty, because obviously, like, you don't want to send the convoy in unescorted. So, like, yes, theoretically, it would be nice to keep her with the fleet for, like, the potential naval engagement. But on the other hand, that then means that some lucky Japanese destroyers will massacre your convoys, and, like, you cannot do anything about it. There was a question from the real IDAC about the actual Japanese losses in the battle. So I've quickly opened the NavWeb's order of
they lost a couple of troop transports, and several destroyers were damaged, mostly by their own destroyers' torpedoes.
Yes, but in this actual battle, in the Battle of Java Sea, the Japanese losses were basically
damage.
Light damage to destroyers. Miregumu was hit with 4 wounded. Asagumo hit by destroyer shells with 4 killed. Tokitsukaze hit without casualties, and generally just really, really light damage. On the other hand, the battle took actually quite long, and the Japanese expended quite a lot of ammunition, actually. That's another factor.
I think they got their money's worth, though.
Yes. Even though, well, they got their money's worth of torpedoes. The guns, not really that much. Like, in the first hour of the action, the Japanese recorded some almost 1,300 20-centimeter shells fired for 5 hits, which gives quite a good example of the accuracy that you can expect in long-range naval battles. In the second hour,
but one of those 5
shells,
hits did knock out the Exeter.
Yes.
Or remove it from the line of battle, which is effectively the same thing.
Yes. And also prevented her from actually being able to run away. And at the same time, the Allied ships were also expending a lot of ammunition, and basically in the following, well, not even battle, in the Sunda Strait, the
Houston ran out of ammo. It was firing star shells.
Yes, and Perth, I believe, as well, was pretty low. So it was a actually fairly long engagement. It was lasting for several hours, and both sides were firing a lot.
Yeah. Although in the Battle of the Sunda Strait, the fact that the Perth and the Houston were able to score hits on Japanese destroyers with 50 caliber machine guns indicates how close that battle was getting.
Yes.
Yeah, there's the Java Sea and Sunda Strait. They're almost the complete opposites of each other when it comes to engagement ranges. But this is one of the things of, as we said right at the intro of this particular Armchair Admirals, it is one of the more forgotten engagements, and it's very easy to sort of for a lot of people when you look at the Pacific campaign to go, oh, Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Midway, Philippines Sea or Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Leyte Gulf, end of war. So you kind of get this impression that it was just, the Japanese went to war and silly Japanese, they got rolled over. It's not actually a fact that, well, apart from anything else, Coral Sea was a tactical victory for the Japanese, even if they didn't accomplish their strategic objectives. But there's an awful lot of other battles in late 41 and through 42 and even into the early part of 43 that the Japanese are coming off the better in. Sometimes they complete all their objectives, like in this battle. Other times, even if their strategic objectives are stopped, they're still able to pull off a tactical victory in as much as they inflict more losses on the Allies than they take. So it is a fairly serious struggle with wins and losses on both sides.
Yeah,
This
I
one's
would.
definitely an Allied
Yeah.
loss.
Yeah, I would actually like to point out one thing that's also quite often overlooked and that I didn't realize until I was reading the Hara's Memoirs, the Japanese destroyer captain book. By the way, recommend. It's a very unique perspective. That basically at this time of war, basically as you like what you can see here, the deployment on the map. Well, I don't actually know where the stream viewers have the map, but you can see that the Japanese destroyers were deployed basically in 2 squadrons, each led by light cruiser, as was prescribed by the doctrine, which meant that basically they were in this squadron in which they were training together for years. It was basically a highly professional outfit, highly tightly knitted teams, and this was absolutely devastating at the beginning of the war because basically the destroyer commanders knew exactly what they should be doing, exactly when they should be doing it, and they had a very good central command. Based on partially on the experience from here, the Japanese actually found that the light cruisers are not ideal for this job because they were actually too slow, too big, and not armed well enough to do their proper job, as in keeping enemy light cruisers off their destroyers. So as the war progressed, the light cruisers became more like staff ships that were in major bases and stuff like that, and the squadron commanders usually put their flag on a destroyer, which meant, like, okay, they were on a fast enough ship, but they had the worst command facilities, so that knocked down the performance a bit. Another big blow.
The Japanese also have the disadvantage in that respect, is that outside of the Aganos, which in and of themselves aren't actually designed as fleet light cruisers, they don't have any modern light cruisers.
Yes.
Everything they've got is basically early to mid 1920s vintage, if you're lucky. Whereas once you start seeing significant numbers of light cruisers appear all over the place, the Allies have got things like the Brooklyns, which do quite a lot of the light cruiser heavy lifting. But to be honest, once they get going, even the Leanders are significantly superior to the Japanese light cruisers. Once things have started to even up a little bit, which means that the Japanese are then left relying on their heavy cruisers, which are fine. The Japanese heavy cruisers are quite nice ships, but when you're talking about these kinds of actions as the war progresses, where there's lots of destroyers present, a light cruiser with rapid firing 6-inch guns is actually a much better platform to be aboard than a heavy cruiser with 8-inch guns.
Yes.
And that it begins to sting the Japanese more and more as these actions go on.
Yes,
basically what I British.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to quickly finish the thought before I lose it, because that's also what went away in 1942-1943 for the Japanese, because basically these tightly knit destroyer squadrons, because of even just regular wear and tear when individual destroyers had to go for refits because their engines were already worn out and stuff, because of combat damage, because of losses, these squadrons were basically being disassembled. Like you had out of squadron of 9 ships, you had 1 year after the war, you had 5 ships. So if you needed more, you had to take destroyers from a different squadron. And that meant then that you suddenly didn't have this homogeneous group. You had already a mix of different squadrons where the captains didn't know each other so well, where the commanding officer didn't know all his captains, and they were often basically put together within minutes, within half a day. Basically, Americans are here, what we need to send here? We have 3 destroyers from Squadron 1, 2 destroyers from Squadron 2, and 1 destroyer each from Squadrons 7 and 9. Okay, put them together, sail, have fun. So this basically in the Java Sea, that was I would say the peak condition for the Japanese fleet screen, for the heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and the destroyers, and it showed.
Yeah. I mean, because these guys had been working together, they'd been training together, and they were conducting an operation that they, unlike the Allies, had actually planned for.
Yes. In a way that they planned for. Basically, the Java Sea was kind of perfectly in the line of the Japanese decisive battle doctrine, the clash of the light forces.
Yeah, and to elaborate on Jingle's point, it's not only is this a campaign and a battle the Japanese have planned for, it's precisely the engagement that the various Allied navies haven't planned for, because the British strategy was send a stocking great fleet to Singapore and then march up from the Indian Ocean into the Western Pacific like a wrecking ball. The American plan was fall back to Pearl Harbor and basically do the same. The Australian plan was help out whichever of those two is doing the wrecking ball thing. And the Dutch plan was have just enough forces and look threatening enough that the Japanese will go after the bigger threats first rather than risk losing too many ships tackling the small fry before going after the big guys. And instead, you have the Japanese basically going straight for the throat of the Dutch holdings, and the Americans, obviously with the Pearl Harbor attacks, are still reorganizing their forces. The British are fighting the Germans and the Italians at sea already, so they can't send in the kind of forces they want to do. And so the Australians are kind of left sitting there going, "Oh, are we the largest naval presence in this area? This is an unexpected turn of events."
And
Yes.
the real shortage for the British were the destroyers, because, and this is the thing you have to realize, the British are the other navy which have really practiced night fighting. But this kind of night fighting, this freewheeling night fighting, the Royal Navy had pretty much concentrated on their destroyer forces. And the thing is, you do not have homogeneous flotillas left out there. So the British have suffered the same thing early on in the war that the Japanese would suffer later on. The British would build back up to that. But also, you look at the sort of destroyers the British would like out there, and if they're talking about night fighting, well, if you go to the pursuit of the Bismarck, the hunt of the Bismarck, if you go to the Battle of Cape Bon, if you go to Narvik, if you go to several of these battles, certain destroyers keep turning up into all of them at the front, because that's what their crews and they've been trained for. That's the tribal class. The Royal Navy sort of, in the nicest way, they fill the light cruiser role of what the Japanese the forces have been doing. They're supposed to be theoretically a destroyer leader, but actually the Royal Navy's gone, hang on, we've got these destroyers which are quite tough and big, could fulfill the cruiser role in peacetime, but in wartime, put them all together and just basically point them in the direction of the enemy and go, have fun. And that is what they're designed for. So the thing is, the Royal Navy is caught off foot. It's fighting in the Mediterranean. It's fighting in the Atlantic. So it hasn't got any of the forces out there. And the really biggest example you can tell that in Java Sea, which is the heavy cruiser the British have there. It's HMS Exeter, a Type B county class. It's something which is supposed to look big and scary on paper, but is actually the whole concept of the Type B was they would be cheaper versions of the Type A, the proper county class, which would be cheaper on tonnage and cheaper on everything, which could be used in secondary areas like, I don't know, the South Atlantic to protect commerce and convoy escort. The traditional
cruiser role.
The traditional cruiser roles, but not the, how do I put this? Not the front line fighting, straight in the fighting center. They, instead of being the, if you were talking about the rated ships, they would be a fourth rate rather than a third or a second or a first rate. So they might form part of the line of battle, but really they're your heavy frigate and they're out there doing those sort of jobs. Yeah. That is what the Type B cruiser was really for. So Exeter's the one there, but it kind of demonstrates by its very presence what Britain was really expecting to find out there and what it was really expecting to do. It was a thing of, we've deployed a heavy cruiser, we've got a heavy cruiser out there, so that shows our intent. But really, it's not one of the heavy cruisers which we need for doing the heavy fighting and the heavy lifting, which we're doing mainly in the Mediterranean. Because let's be honest, it's the Italian Navy which is taking far more of the Royal Navy's attention than the German Navy in terms of heavy units. The German Navy, their submarines and the threat there about their big surface raiders, those do have a certain amount of attention. But if you're looking at pound for pound on ships, it's the Italian Navy which is really sucking up the Royal Navy.
Yes. It's worth noting that basically later on in the year, when it was clear that the Pacific is the thing that needs bolstering, there were actually two counties, the Canberra and the Australia, sent back to the Pacific, but they had to be taken from European field, right? They were, yeah. And promptly Canberra got sunk at Savo Island, obviously, but there is a question from Mdigidog. In the aftermath of the defeat, why were none of the major surviving ABDA ships able to escape to India or Australia? Why did they all get caught?
Have you got that map of the Java Sea?
Yes, I am going to put the map on here.
No, the other one. There it is.
Yep.
Take a look at the Java Sea. You've got Borneo to the north, Sumatra to the west, Java itself to the south. See those narrow gaps where you can get into and out of the Java Sea? Japan was planning an attack on this place for quite some time, and they had land-based aircraft that were flying patrols over all of those gaps to ensure that nobody would interfere with the transports. And the thing about those air patrols is that they can spot ships going out just as easily as they can spot ships going in. So getting out of the Java Sea was a lot more problematic than simply saying, okay, head for this strait and out we go, as the Perth and the Houston found out as a result of sailing into the Sunda Strait based on intelligence that they received that said it was absolutely 100% clear, absolutely guaranteed, no shit, honest, and in fact turned out to have an entire Japanese amphibious invasion force and around about 20 destroyers in it.
Never believe an intelligence officer who says honest. Remember, they are betting your life, not their own.
Yeah, getting out of the Java Sea at that time was far from simple.
Yes,
which is why the Perth and the Houston tried to sneak out through the Sunda Strait at night, because that was their best chance of avoiding detection. Yes. Unfortunately, the timing was just a little bit off.
Yeah,
and another thing, the ships were damaged as well, which reduced their speed, like Exeter.
Yes. Another thing that basically there wasn't one Japanese landing force, there wasn't one Japanese surface force, because Japan were landing 5 divisions and they were landing them kind of spread out to obviously capture all the important objectives. And each of these landing forces had their own escort, so you had basically heavy cruisers all over the place. And once the ABDA fleet was broken, then each of these heavy cruiser forces was more than enough to basically deal with any single escaping ship or any pair of escaping ships. So that's also why there was that Dutch minesweeper that very successfully imitated Island during all this time. And basically her commander realized that well, there's a lot of air reconnaissance, there's a lot of things going on around here, and decided that the safest thing for him to do is to basically sneak along the coast during the day, pretend that he's an island. He had his crew actually change the camouflage made out of trees periodically to match with what was actually on the island he was hiding at. So, he was actually managing to sneak out very successfully, and the ship survives to this day in Den Helder. So, I recommend visiting. It was actually fairly...
It's a very cool story. It is a very, very cool story.
But it also shows that basically how the situation was, because after the Dutch East Indies fell, a lot of there was a very strong evacuation effort, basically trying to get everyone to Australia, and a lot of these evacuation ships were intercepted and sunk by planes or by surface forces, because obviously once the Japanese were able to move their aviation up to Java, then they could reach all the way to Australia, all the way to Darwin, and Australia wasn't ready for that. So there weren't that strong anti-aircraft defenses around Darwin Harbour. So it was a huge mess. There's
one of the stories of our colleague from Bilge Pumps, which, by the way, has this week had episode 38 is all about section 22, and all their radar hunting of Japanese radar. And if you want to see an American intelligence muck-up, an Allied intelligence muck-up in World War II, especially in a cover-up post-World War II, there's the whole saga of Japanese radar and how it doesn't exist, but we're using all the Japanese. We've got a special unit out hunting it, spoofing it, and then when we find when we land, we take over the sites which had Japanese radar to put our radar on because they're the best sites. Yet the Japanese didn't have any radar. Anyway, when we were talking to him, Jamie, our colleague, when we were talking about and preparing for it, but Jamie didn't manage to make it to the actual episode. Jamie, our colleague who's Australian, was talking about Darwin and how at one point, the Australians, because they think there's some Japanese attack coming, almost abandoned Darwin. A lot of senior officers disappear from there because it's got no defences. And that's part of the reasons why, that's a very big reason why the British are fighting at Java and why the British are pushing people to fight at Java, is because Australia really isn't prepared, because the idea was always that it would be Singapore, which is the main base, and the British would be going on the offensive as soon as possible. So they would be fighting out of probably way, a long way away from Australia, so Australia wouldn't need the defensive.
There is a question from King Lord Bruce. What do you think would have been the result if the Allied forces had any clue as to the capabilities of the Long Lance torpedo?
They might not have been so keen to fight the Japanese at night.
Yeah, and in this battle, I think also they would have been taking evasive action.
Yeah.
This is one of the things you've got to remember. Yes, the Long Lance is incredibly long range, but it does take a while to get there. It can take 15, 20 minutes, half an hour to cross the distance from launch to some of the ranges that they were shooting at. And if a ship does anything at that point to change course during that fairly long time, it's going to be in a completely different location to where you've shot, which in part is why so many of them don't actually hit anything. But because the Allies don't know that the torpedo has this range, they're basically sailing in as straight a line as possible, because that makes gunnery solutions easier, because they think they're in a gunnery duel. And if your enemy is just going to sail in a lovely straight line, well, then in that case, yeah, you probably can take a shot with a torpedo that's going to hit 15 minutes later, because they're just going and going. So yeah, I think if they'd known about the Long Lance, they probably would have introduced at least some form of zigzagging to their battle maneuvers, which would have preserved. I don't know how to pronounce it. Courtenay.
Courtenay.
Yeah.
There you go.
Courtenay.
Yeah. Who's the first one who catches a Long Lance, and then as Jingles said, maybe slightly less enthusiastic, either less enthusiastic about engaging the Japanese, or much more centered on pushing for a pell-mell melee battle where it's much harder to get a bead for a torpedo launch, as opposed to a kind of vaguely standoffish gunfight again, in which again it's much easier to estimate your range.
And
Yes,
confusingly,
just-
at that point, actually, HMS Exeter would have had an advantage because she's a slightly shorter heavy cruiser, so she has a tighter turning circle. So a pell-mell battle for her is actually she's got a maneuverability advantage over those 10-gun heavy cruisers of the Japanese, and she could be able to use that. Probably won't. They'll probably still be hopelessly outgunned and blown out the water, but there is a theoretical capability there at which point she could do something.
I think, honestly, realistically, if we'd had a greater appreciation for the Long Lancer's capabilities and we'd sailed zigzag patterns, the only realistic result would have been that we'd have lost more ships to the heavy cruisers than we did to the torpedoes launched by the destroyers.
Just to underscore the problems of launching these long-range volleys, in the battle, the Japanese launched in total 164 torpedoes and scored 3 hits. So, like, yes, the performance was impressive, but it was a lot, in a large part, it was a game of numbers. Just fill the water with torpedoes and something will hit. And it was also kind of a thing of a bad timing, because after the Cortina was sunk, the ABDA forces actually did start evasive maneuvers, but those evasive maneuvers in the end did lead them into the second salvo of torpedoes, because that's kind of a difficult situation when you have so many torpedoes in the water. And
Flood the sea with torpedoes.
Yes.
It's kind of like the Soviet approach to overwhelming NATO anti-missile defenses during the Cold War.
Yes. And
It's a
that's
hit
actually
rate of 1.85%.
yes.
Yes.
This
Although,
actually
to be fair,
ties
that's
to
actually-
yeah. Continue.
So I was going to say 1.85%. It sounds very low, and it is very low. But it's also, while it is at the lower end of things, it's actually not a completely out of the question accuracy rating for naval gunnery at the time.
Yes.
The very accurate radar guided naval gunnery of the latter part of World War II is still a couple of years away, and since I am almost genetically obligated to find some way to blame BT in every Armchair Admirals, I will actually point out that BT's battle cruisers at Jutland had a worse accuracy rating, gunnery
That was a
accuracy.
0.9% accuracy rating?
Yeah, it depends how you count it, but yes, it's the battle cruiser fleet at Jutland has a worse accuracy rate while firing with rangefinders and shells that only need 20 seconds to arrive instead of half an hour. So, yeah, it's not brilliant compared to some torpedo engagements where you get 10, 12, 15% hit rate, but it's not abysmal.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
can I just add a note
yes.
for my figures that I've just given? I worked them out in my head as I sat here, so if they are wrong, I'm a historian, not a mathematician. If I'm right, woohoo!
Yeah, I mean, we touched that already earlier when I was reading out the hit rate for the first hour of engagement when the Japanese heavy cruisers fired 1,300 shells and hit 5. So compared to that, the torpedoes are still quite a good investment. Not as good as the Japanese Navy hoped to get in these situations, because the Fury for the Kantai Kessen was counting, I think, with like 10 to 20% hit rate, but still better than the guns. So, well, and one torpedo hit usually means the ship is definitely at least crippled, if not outright sunk. And that actually is leading to a question from Dry Alga. A large part of the defeat of the ABDA fleet is due to sinking of flagship De Ruyter and the death of Admiral Dorman. De Ruyter sank because of a single torpedo hit by the Haguro, which disabled all electrical systems. Was it common for light cruisers and other light vessels to be completely incapacitated or sunk by a single torpedo hit, or was this a lucky hit for the Haguro? No, this definitely was not a lucky hit, especially not for the Type 93 torpedo, because that was kind of outlier in all torpedoes. It had very, very heavy warhead compared to the 21-inch torpedoes or especially to the airplane torpedoes. So usually a hit with Type 93 was very bad news for every ship that it happened. Granted, it exploded. There were cases when the Japanese torpedoes didn't explode. There were cases they explode prematurely. But if it did explode, it was a very bad news not only for light cruisers. I mean, just look at the Battle of Tassafaronga. Basically, I think every of the American heavy cruisers damaged there or sunk there was hit by one torpedo, and it ended with one sunk and one sunk, two losing their bows, so effectively crippled, and one losing the engines. So again, basically one hit, one ship, at least for 1 year in the shipyard.
The other thing you've got to remember is where are you hitting? Where are you getting hit? Because if you get hit on the extremities, it's going to hurt, but most of your reserve buoyancy is still intact. So if you get hit amidships, that's much worse news. But also, and this goes back to when we were talking about the relative strengths of the ships near the beginning, not all light cruisers are created equal.
Yes.
If you have something like a Brooklyn class or a Town class or a Cleveland class takes a hit, they're light cruisers, but they're 10,000-ton light cruisers. They're not going to walk it off, but they might be able to make it home. The Dutch cruisers and Perth and even Exeter, as we said, they're all undersized. They're 5,000 to 7,000 tons roughly, which means there's just less of them to absorb an impact. So if those kind of cruisers take a hit, then yeah, they're pretty much totaled, unless they get lucky enough to get hit on an extremity.
It's basically, if you can be hit in the bow, like HMS Eskimo was at Narvik. I keep referring back to Tribals, but it's a good example. She gets her bow completely blown off, and there's a few other examples of it. Then you can almost weather the hit more of a heavy torpedo than if you get hit in the center. If you get hit in the center, that can cause a lot of trouble because there's a lot of systems there which will be dependent on it. If you're hit on one of the extremities, you can lock it off to an extent and keep going, or at least limp somewhere.
There's actually an interesting question from Palervon. Didn't the Japanese find a large number of torpedoes on the beach after the Battle of Sanda Strait? I could believe so, because I mean that battle was close to the shore, and with the range of the Type 93, I guess a lot of the fishes were ending washed up.
Yeah.
Well, it's one
It's
of the
always
things.
nice. It makes logistics so much easier when you can reuse weapons.
I mean, this is one of the things with the long lance. Most torpedoes, if you launch them in a sea battle, they'll just run out of fuel and keel over. But with the long lances, the ranges are so long, they may very well just end up fetching up on a beach at some point.
Ian Stradling, what ship was it? Was the surviving front of one ship welded to the surviving rear of another? That was HMS Zubian in World War One.
Which was a composite of HMS Zulu and HMS
Nubian.
Yeah, there it is.
And there's actually kind of an inverse of that. I believe in the Second World War, when HMS Porcupine is blown in two, and they actually lose the amidship section, and they're just like, well, we don't have a spare amidship section, so they just tow the two. Amazingly enough, the two halves stay afloat, so they tow the two halves back to port, and then they become HMS Pork and HMS Pine, and used as accommodation.
Well, I mean, that's kind of like the longest ship in the U.S. Navy, right? The USS Pittsburgh that lost its bow in a typhoon, and the bow stayed afloat at Guam, and the ship was sent to the west coast.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are good ships. They do tend to have characters themselves. I do love, and this is one of the things with ABDA. You can, because of the things that happen, because of the losses they achieve, it is a very easy thing. And one of the things that annoys me sometimes is I have colleagues who do this, or I see people doing this, they write it off as Dorman is a bad admiral, or that the Allies were completely useless ships, etc. No, they actually were individually. The ships do quite well. Their crews are fighting very hard. They're just completely outmatched by the circumstances and by the Japanese wielding weapon systems which, even though the Allies knew about, in terms of the Americans knew about the Long Lance torpedo, their actual high commands didn't believe they had.
Yes.
And you cannot fight a battle where your own high command is telling you a weapon doesn't exist, or rather not even mentioning it, so you can't factor it into your plans. And one of the interesting things is, as time goes on, you actually have senior American, senior Allied commanders factoring in weapon systems which their central bureaucracy is telling them don't exist, but they are going, well, our battle experience suggests this might exist. So we will start factoring this into our operations and just ignore the high command.
You see, Dr. Clarke actually makes a very good point here, because even at individual ship levels, the operations room, which I believe they call the Combat Information Center on board American ships, before you go into a battle, there's a threat briefing so that everybody knows and understands exactly the situation and the threat that they face. Where somebody's job it is to stand up and brief all of the ops room staff on, okay, the threat today is fighter bombers. Weapons consist of bombs, rockets, and cannon. They have this kind of bomb, these kind of rockets, this kind of cannon. It will do this amount of damage. The characteristics of the weapons and the performance delivery envelope mean that we will have to be, bring the ship on a blah, blah, blah course. And they go through it in great detail. If you don't even know what the threat is, how can you plan against it?
Yes.
And to be fair, they did the same thing in they practiced the same thing and been doing that since, well, similar briefings have been given to Royal Navy ships since, I think, it's one of the reforms Fisher starts with exercises long when he's in command of the Mediterranean Fleet. He starts getting them used to it. And in the right way through World War II, it's the Jimmy, the XOs, the second in command of the ship's job to provide this briefing and to write it up so that the captain can concentrate on running the ship. And of course, the executive officer is in charge of damage control, those sort of things. But to make sure the executive officer understands what's going on. So if the captain's knocked out, the executive officer is able to take over and understands knows the threats. The executive officer had to give the briefing and had to know the stuff. That was the plan. So you'd have sort of the executive officer would, by teaching everyone else and telling everyone else what the threat was, they would themselves make sure they understood it. So if they had to take over on the fly because the captain got killed, because remember, captains are conning their ships very much from the best viewpoint in the house, which is the open bridge, because it's still all Mark 1 eyeball at this time. Even night fighting, the captains will be up on the open bridge. That's their job, and that's what they're doing. They cannot prepare accurately if they don't have accurate information. They just can't. And the Japanese do have accurate information. That's the big thing. They do know exactly what they're facing.
There is a question on YouTube. Christian Montero. Did these ships have torpedo protection? It's easy to assume they did, but what was the reality? I think the reality is that no torpedo blisters on destroyers and especially light cruisers. That's that's a luxury for battleships.
You can't do anything for torpedo protection on
Yes.
destroyers at that size. I mean, the torpedo protection on some battleships is wider than the beam of some of the destroyers total.
Yeah.
There's not a lot you can do for 50 caliber machine gun protection on destroyers of that size. So you can forget torpedo protection.
You have to remember, destroyers during this sort of treaty era were limited to roughly 1,500 tons. Destroyer leaders, the percentage you were allowed of them, were about 1,850 tons, theoretically. Now, if you consider even the Royal Navy with the tribal class destroyers, not a single one of them, and I've written a book on this, not a single one of them was 1,850 tons. They were all over. Every single one of them, without drop, but not by much. And so there is not much you can do on less than 2,000 tons. We call a Zumwalt today a Zumwalt is classified as a destroyer by the US Navy today, and that is 14,000 tons. So that's 7 times a destroyer of the interwar period, a larger destroyer.
That's basically
In other words, It's a
Yeah.
flotilla, or it weighs the same amount as an entire flotilla of World War II, beginning of World War II destroyers probably did.
It's heavier than even the Japanese heavy cruisers involved in this battle, which were
Yeah.
already overweight for heavy cruisers. So that's. I have a question here, for myself, because I see a comment, but I don't see who made it actually. What is the Blackburn cult?
Oh, okay. I will answer. On my channel, I a long time ago mentioned that there was a very, very ugly aircraft which served in the Fleet Air Arm at the beginning of the interwar era as a spotter aircraft and reconnaissance aircraft. It's called the Blackburn. The reason it's called that is because the Royal Navy ordered it. Well, the Air Ministry ordered it on behalf of the Royal Navy, and Blackburn delivered it, and it was originally called the R1. And basically, the Royal Navy went, well, you need a name. An aircraft needs a name. And someone just wrote, well, it's from Blackburn, so we'll call it the Blackburn. And it is the ugliest looking aircraft, bar none, in my opinion. It's somehow, since I've mentioned this, it has formed a cult.
Okay.
And now I have on my channel, people go hail the Blackburn, and send prayers up to it. And
I think they've
Drac
already gone
and
through a
Jamie
schism.
regularly wind me up over this thing.
Yeah, I think they've already had a schism, but I
yes,
think
there is now a schism between the people who hail the Blackburn, and there's another group which hail the Avro Bison, and we won't get into the ones who are talking about something else. And there's an Orthodox church, there's a Protestant, there's a Reformed church.
Okay.
It's quite worrying.
Yes.
I love my subscribers and viewers; they are wonderful people. There is certainly something starting to worry me.
Look on the bright side; it keeps them off the streets.
It does.
Yeah. For reference, for those of you who may be used to slightly more modern aircraft than vaguely antique biplanes, the Blackburn is kind of on a par with, I'd say, so maybe the designer's son went to work for Fairey, and that's how you got the Gannet.
No, the Gannet is positively beautiful compared to the Blackburn.
It's several generations of advancement over the.
Yes.
Since we touched airplanes, there was actually a question in the pre-filled questions. I cannot find it now, but basically it was whether Admiral Dorman leaving his scout planes from his ships behind at base, whether it did influence the battle.
I'd say on one hand, yes, because it means that fully fueled non scout planes getting set on fire didn't cause any further damage to the ships that he had. But as you mentioned earlier, yes, sure. I mean, if he'd managed to be able to use them to spot during the day, but most of the battle took place at night when he wouldn't have been able to use them anyway. So I don't think he lost anything by leaving them behind, other than ensuring that he didn't have fireballs waiting to happen in the midships of the various ships that had them.
Which actually was quite forward-thinking of him, because the U.S. Navy had to learn this lesson at the Savo Island when basically plane fires caused a lot of damage. Then the U.S. Navy had to relearn the lesson at the second night battle of Guadalcanal, when the South Dakota managed to set her scout planes on her fantail on fire by the muzzle blast of her guns, which was kind of unfortunate. Fortunately, the second salvo then knocked the burning wreckage overboard. So, that was one thing that, like, basically, as with everything, you have to balance things. It's the same with the Type 93 torpedoes, because they run on pure oxygen, which means that they have to be loaded with pure oxygen. The ship has to have a oxygen producing plant, and it means that if enemy as much as looks at them, they have tendency to burst in fire. So on one side you have extremely highly powered torpedo, extremely good. On the other side, your ship is a giant bomb just waiting to explode. So it's like you can't really have...
To be honest, the spotter aircraft would have been even more of a problem at the night fighting, because if they had been turned into fire, warps, they'd have made lovely targets for the 8-inch guns, wouldn't they?
Yes.
And let's
Was
be
it-
honest, that would have just increased the kill rate.
Was it the Mogami at the battle one retreating from the Battle of Midway, who it was thanks to the forethought of a junior officer throwing the aircraft overboard and ditching all of the torpedoes because he knew they were about to come under air attack, that basically saved the ship.
Yes, the
Yeah.
damage control officer there did order basically everything thrown overboard that could be dismounted. And unlike Mikuma, the Mogami survived. The Mikuma succumbed mostly to huge fires started in the torpedo section. So,
Yeah,
and it wasn't the only Japanese cruiser lost to the fire caused by the torpedo. Basically, I would say at least half of the Japanese heavy cruisers that were lost in major part to this. So
towards the end of the war, though, it became almost, not quite, almost a standing order that in the event of air attack, you had to try and get rid of your torpedoes as quickly as humanly possible.
yes,
And sometimes ships didn't do it, and sometimes they'd make it through, but other times not so much.
yeah. Basically,
just-
the ships
I just-
did. Yeah, sorry.
I just googled the Blackburn.
Yes, it's ugly. It's hidden.
Get
told
thee
you not to.
behind me, Satan!
Are you sure you want that thing following you, though?
Maybe that was the idea. Maybe the idea was that the looks of the plane would completely disgust any enemy AA gunner, and he wouldn't be able to even aim, let alone pull the trigger.
The thing is, they're the spotters for battleships, so they're designed to carry Admiralty shots. There's a perfectly sensible reason for why they're the shape they are. It's just that
you know what it looks
ugly.
It looks like a Westland Wessex with wings.
Yes, actually it does.
Oh, Commander Rockstone. Everyone Googled that one. Yes, we are not responsible for any damage you might have suffered.
Yes, we are not responsible. If you have to go through counselling, that's on you.
They even did a float plane version.
Oh, God.
Oh, don't look it up. Do not look it up. Trust me, it's worse.
Oh dear.
Yes, it seems that YouTube chat is also now Googling the plane, so yeah. I'm afraid now we will get reported for promoting such an abomination.
Well, it's just as well since the gods of chaos are infesting the World of Warship servers. So
Yeah. Here I have the question. Yeah, so we answered the scout plane question, and the second part was it a mistake from the combined fleet to attack the better armed and equipped Japanese fleet? Live to fight another day might have been better. Well, that's the thing. You don't really know how much better armed the enemy is, especially since still, most people expected that the Japanese heavy cruisers are fitting into the 10,000 tons limit, and sometimes you just gotta do what you gotta do. The main objective here was to get to the transport ships. So basically, if the cruisers managed to engage enemy cruisers and the destroyers got through, it was worth a try, probably.
Yeah.
But
Was it a mistake? Well, they all died, so yes.
Yeah.
In that respect, absolutely categorically, it was a mistake. But they had to fight the Japanese, or they were going to take the Dutch East Indies, which was the Japanese entire war aim, and then they would have been able to attack Australia, and both the Australians, quite understandably, and the British didn't want that. That would have given serious issues to American attempts to build up forces to counterattack, because then they'd have to skirt all the way around to the east of Australia. So you don't win wars by not fighting the enemy. And based on the information that they had, they probably thought they had a fairly good chance.
Yeah, I mean,
The
on
problem is the
paper-
information they had was shit.
yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And a lot of the things were in the soft factors that we mentioned, the training, the communication, which on the paper you have two heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, 2 light cruisers. Okay, a lot of destroyers, but the light cruisers will take care of that, right? That's why they are built. So it wasn't really that imbalanced on paper. In
On
reality,
paper,
given
it
all the
looked great.
issues. Yeah, and it would have looked even greater just a week earlier when there were 2 more light cruisers available, right? But the reality then is that
If you were in
I mean,
Washington, London, or anywhere like that, it looked great on paper. You were
Yes.
sort of sitting there going, we're sitting pretty, it's wonderful. If you
Yeah.
were sitting in Fremantle, Darwin, probably slightly less good. If you were sitting anywhere in the Dutch East Indies, probably sitting there going, quite sure. If you're poor Admiral Dorman, you're probably going, I am an officer of duty. I have my orders. I will do my best. Come, let us be friends. And everyone's going, do we trust you? You seem like a nice guy. This is not the situation where we really want a nice guy. Again, Admiral Tom Phillips would have been quite useful. He's quite blunt, so would probably have been okay. There are lots. There's even a couple of Dutch officers, which I'm not going to try and mangle their names because I will mangle the names, who, if they had been around, would have been quite useful. I think, as I've said, the problem with poor Dorman is he was a nice guy.
The other thing you've got to remember when it comes to maybe try and fight another day, as pointed out, the Japanese have their ships scattered in multiple different escort packages for multiple different invasion convoys at this point. So with the forces you've got available, you have an on-paper chance of breaking through one of the screens and taking out one of the troop convoys. If you withdraw, not only do you lose the Dutch East Indies, but the next time you face off against the Japanese fleet, all of those individual cruiser units and destroyer flotillas will probably all be operating together, and then you're not going to have any chance, even on paper. If the Japanese show up with half a dozen or more heavy cruisers and you've got two.
Yes, that's actually another point that we touched in the beginning, that basically this entire campaign was extremely confused from both sides, because the Allies had a very composite force that was scattered all over the place, but the Japanese had also, they had a pair of heavy cruisers here, a pair of heavy cruisers there. That's actually how the old American destroyers were able to get among these transports, because the heavy cruisers that were supposed to go with them just weren't there because they were somewhere else covering another group. So it was there was a realistic chance to do some damage and delay the Japanese. That's the thing.
I don't want to be a party pooper, but I'm going to have to go soon.
Yeah, I mean, our time has run out, so I think and we ran through most of the questions.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think actually this is a good time to slowly say goodbye. I will first still run the bonus code for people who didn't manage to catch it in time. So, if you didn't get it yet, here's your chance.
Surabaya, you've just been cruel.
Surabaya Okikaisen.
Surabaya Okikaisen.
Something like that. Yes. Yes.
And,
although before we go, we probably should mention next month.
Next month, we actually already have a topic, which I right now completely forgot. So
it's the Battle of Cape Matapan.
Yes. So we will be moving from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, and we will be sticking with the Royal Navy, but now there will be some Italians around, which I mean perfectly fits with the Italian arc we right now are having. There is a quick question from Simon Edwards for Drachinifel. What are those ships behind you? So finally someone noticed.
I was wondering how long it was going to take. So this is the Unbound Flame, a Salamander strike cruiser, and this is an unpronounceable code of binary, which is a Mechanicus Firestorm frigate. These are both ship models from Warhammer 40,000, which I thought I'd put up there because of the Warhammer 40k little release that's going on at the moment. But yeah, these are, for those of you who may have played the old Battlefleet Gothic game back in the day when it was a tabletop game and not a computer game, you will recognize they are substantially larger than average because these are massively oversized, but they are absolutely hilarious.
I mean, isn't that the basic idea of the 40k universe, that if something works, you just build a bigger version of it?
Oh yeah, but the put it this way: the biggest game piece in the actual game that was manufactured by Games Workshop would have been one of the Imperial battleships, and that was about 2/3 the length of this little guy down here. And this Firestorm frigate in the game is about an inch long. So yeah, they're much larger. There's a rather wonderful chap who makes
nerds.
I've seen you paint Space Marines jingles better than mine as well.
And I can't comment because this entire shop is going to be for a model run. So yeah.
If anyone wants to know where you can get them, I just drop me a line on Discord or something. I can direct you to the chap who makes them. He's a very nice chap, and I'm sure he'll appreciate the business.
In any case, as we've already said, our time is running short. So, finishing statements. Let's go in the opposite direction. So, Dr. Clarke.
It was a mess, but it had some very good performances on both sides, and honestly, it should be studied in a lot more detail than it is. And half the trouble we have with studying it is the fact that the Japanese did such a good job at the end of the World War II of destroying all their records. So we only really have half the picture from the Japanese because we have some personal accounts, but not all of them, and we have none of their official reports, which of course would include accounts from people who died later in the war. So we have an idea of what went on, but because so many people died on both sides, you only have a sort of a snapshot in many ways of the actual battle, and it'd be really useful to know more because it is a very cool battle in terms of both sides really doing quite well, but in terms of the Allies, they were out-commanded because the commander couldn't communicate with our force, and they were completely out-intelligence because they had no idea what they were up against. Especially in terms of weaponry.
Yes. Drachinifel.
Yeah, well, it's one of a series of disasters that will very quickly see ABDA command dissolved. And while some lessons are learned from it, other lessons are not. And the Allies will go on in surface ship actions to mostly get the short end of the stick when it comes to the Pacific for a good long while. It takes a fair amount of time to overcome the Japanese advantage in this area, and this is one of the more important lessons I think sometimes gets overlooked. This was a serious war. Yes, it's easy to say at the end of it, thanks to the industrial might of the US, amongst other things, the Japanese didn't have a chance of winning the war in the long term, but in the short to medium term, there's an awful lot of people who were going out there and fighting as hard as they could, and an awful lot of them didn't come back. And unfortunately for the crews of the Dutch and British and American and Australian ships who were part of ABDA command, there were an awful lot of them who suffered for reasons that were really far beyond their control and more to do with the people back home.
Thank you. And Jingles.
For anybody who's interested in reading more about the Battle of the Java Sea and the Battle of the Sunda Strait, I can highly recommend a book by our friend Jim Hornfisher, who has been on this show before. Ship of Ghosts, the story of specifically HMS Houston, but he goes into great detail about all of the events leading up to, as well as the Battle of the Java Sea, the Battle of the Sunda Strait, and then what happened to the survivors of the Houston and the Perth afterwards as they endured years of captivity at the hands of the Japanese. It's a fantastic book. You can get it in paper, hard copy. It's also available on Kindle and Audible, and I can't recommend it enough.
Thank you. Well, and for me, the last word is that this was a very interesting chat for me because I learned a lot of new things from you gentlemen as well. And I'm happy that we were able to cover this, not that well-known battle and to make honor to everyone involved. Because, I mean, let's face it, it was a very spectacular Japanese victory. It was at the same time very valiant, even if losing effort from all the crews of the Allied ships. So, yes.
And
Thank
it was the
you for-
USS Houston, obviously, not HMS Houston. I'm sorry, I did it again.
Well,
It's
I mean,
because,
you have
know,
to. You have to
it's
make
because you really
honor
want-
to your captain. You like it's your trait in game, so you have to do. So yeah, guys, thank you for visiting us. Thank you everyone on YouTube, on Twitch for watching our stream, and see you around in the next stream in 1 month for Battle of the Cap Matapan.
Mhm.
And that's it for today. Thank you. Bye bye, and have fun.